On a cold winter morning in the deep south, a plantation's silence was broken by a cruel act that would not be forgotten. An overseer, drunk on authority and arrogance, spat on a slave woman as she lay dying, her life slipping away under the weight of exhaustion and suffering. It was a moment meant to humiliate, to assert dominance over someone utterly powerless, but fate has a way of twisting justice. That single hateful gesture set off a chain of events that would bring retribution in the most unexpected and chilling way, ensuring that the overseer would never live to see another Christmas morning. This is a story of cruelty, endurance, and the swift, uncanny reckoning that followed a moment of profound injustice. The overseer on the plantation was a man whose presence alone could make the air feel heavier. A figure both feared and resented by those under his authority. He carried himself with a swagger that spoke of entitlement, the kind of entitlement born not from merit or accomplishment but from the unchecked power granted to him by the rigid hierarchy of the plantation system. From the moment he set foot on the property each morning, he projected dominance, his eyes scanning the fields like a hawk surveying prey. Every movement of the slaves was subject to his scrutiny, every pause or falter in their labor considered an insult, an affront to the invisible code he believed he enforced. The overseer's whip, though not always in motion, hung at his side like a constant threat, a reminder that disobedience or perceived slowness could be met with sharp, immediate punishment. His authority was absolute in appearance, yet it was rooted in fear rather than respect, a fragile construct maintained by intimidation and cruelty. He had developed an acute sense for catching the smallest infractions, a raised eyebrow, a slightly slumped posture, or a whispered conversation, and he would pounce on them with precision. Those under him learned to move as though constantly under surveillance, their lives dictated by the tempo of his mood and the whims of his temper. He would stride through the fields, boots thudding against the dry earth, stopping at intervals to bark orders, to shout corrections, and to deliver lashes that were as much about demonstrating his power to the others as they were about punishing the individual. His voice carried over the expanse of the plantation, a harsh, commanding sound that set the rhythm for the day's labor. The slaves learned to anticipate his steps, timing their movements with caution, ever aware that a single misstep could trigger a wave of anger that would fall upon them indiscriminately. Yet his cruelty was not merely a product of his position. It had been honed over years of privilege and reinforced by the complacency of the system around him. The overseer had been born into a society that condoned and rewarded such behavior, where strength was measured not by character or empathy but by the ability to dominate and control. From his earliest years he had witnessed similar acts, seen men like himself wielding authority with impunity, and had internalized the notion that power was inseparable from cruelty. The plantation's hierarchy validated his every harsh word, every lash of the whip, and every act of humiliation, giving him the confidence to act without hesitation. There was no moral reckoning, no consequence, no limit to the depths of his oppression, at least not within the visible scope of his world. The overseer's interaction with the slaves was never one of compassion or guidance. It was a transactional relationship defined by fear and subjugation. He would issue commands not out of efficiency but to assert dominance, often choosing tasks or punishments that were cruelly arbitrary. Even in the midst of routine labor, he found ways to remind the slaves of their helplessness, their position at the mercy of his judgment. He could appear suddenly, inspecting the fields, testing the limits of endurance, watching for signs of fatigue or disobedience. Those who faltered even slightly were singled out, their punishment serving as a warning to the rest. The overseer seemed to derive satisfaction from this display of control, from the visible tension in the shoulders, the stifled sighs, the lowered eyes, and the hesitant movements of those who worked under him. His power was performative, a cruel theater in which he played the lead role, and the plantation was the stage upon which the fear of his authority was enacted day after day. But beneath the surface of his swagger and intimidation lay a certain insecurity, a need to constantly reaffirm his status. The overseer was acutely aware that his position was dependent on the system and on the fear he instilled. He feared being seen as weak, incapable, or too lenient, and so he overcompensated with acts of aggression and harshness. Even minor mistakes, either real or imagined, were magnified in his mind, and he reacted with disproportionate force. The slaves became instruments of his self-assertion, their suffering a measure of his own sense of importance. This need to dominate was a defining characteristic, shaping not only his behavior, but also the environment of the plantation as a whole, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and dread. The overseer's cruelty extended beyond the physical. It was psychological and relentless. He understood the value of humiliation as a tool, knowing that breaking a person's spirit could be as effective as breaking their body. He would single out individuals for ridicule, mock them in front of their peers, and punished them in ways that left scars both visible and invisible. Laughter at the expense of another became a weapon in his hands, and the fields were often filled with the sound of his derision, a constant reminder that no one was beyond his reach. The slaves learned to suppress anger, sorrow, and despair, hiding their true feelings under a mask of obedience, for any display of defiance could provoke the overseer's wrath. Despite the harshness of his methods, the overseer took great care to maintain an appearance of efficiency and control. He prided himself on the productivity of the fields, on the meticulous record of labor completed under his watch, and on the ability to enforce his will without assistance. The plantation's wealth and output were in his mind proof of his competence, even as the human cost went unseen by those who cared only for profit. He was convinced that the end justified the means, that the suffering of the enslaved was a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of order and productivity. His actions were a reflection not only of personal cruelty, but also of the broader social and economic structures that enabled and encouraged such behavior, allowing him to rationalize every act of oppression as a duty or necessity. There were moments when the overseer's presence would stir a quiet, almost imperceptible tension among the enslaved, moments when they exchanged glances that spoke of fear, resentment, and the silent yearning for justice. They watched him closely, noting the patterns in his moods, anticipating the potential for anger, and trying to navigate the dangerous terrain of his temper. Each day was a careful negotiation, a balance between survival and endurance, and the overseer's cruelty was a constant variable that made the smallest misstep potentially catastrophic. His control was absolute in its immediacy, yet fragile in the sense that it relied entirely on his continuous enforcement. The balance of fear he maintained was delicate, and any lapse could reveal the vulnerability beneath the facade of power. The overseer's reputation extended beyond the plantation, becoming a cautionary tale for others in similar positions. He was known for his quick temper, his unwavering enforcement of rules, and his ruthless methods of punishment. Stories of his cruelty traveled across neighboring plantations, serving as a warning to both slaves and overseers alike. Power, when combined with cruelty, was a dangerous force, and the overseer wielded it without hesitation. His name was synonymous with terror, and his actions left a lasting mark on all who witnessed or experienced them. Yet despite his fearsome presence and the terror he instilled, there were subtle signs of the overseer's limitations, moments where his authority was challenged by circumstances beyond his control. Illness, accidents, or the resilience of those he sought to dominate revealed cracks in the armor of his perceived invincibility. These instances, though rare, hinted at the possibility that the overseer's power, while formidable, was not absolute, and that the structures supporting his cruelty could be disrupted in unforeseen ways. Through it all, the overseer continued to enforce his will, to stride through the fields with a relentless energy, and to assert control over those whose lives were entirely at his mercy. His presence defined the rhythm of the plantation, a rhythm dictated by fear, obedience, and the constant threat of punishment. Every slave knew that to encounter the overseer was to face not only the possibility of physical pain but also the weight of psychological domination, a force that shaped their days and haunted their nights. His cruelty was both a personal characteristic and a product of the system that empowered him, and it created a landscape of suffering that would linger in memory long after the overseer himself had faded from view. The slave woman had been working in the fields since the first light of dawn, her body pushed to the brink of exhaustion by the relentless demands of labor and the oppressive weight of the overseer's gaze. Her hands were calloused, her back bent from bending over rows of crops, and every movement was dictated by the pace imposed upon her, a pace that left no room for rest or reprieve. For days she had been battling a fever, the kind that seeped into her bones and made even the simplest movements feel like climbing a mountain, yet she could not afford to slow down. Illness was a dangerous luxury in her world, a weakness that could invite punishment or scorn, and she endured it in silence, determined to fulfill her duties despite the pain. Her body was a testament to the strain of survival, each scar, bruise, and blister a record of the endless toil demanded by those who held her life in their hands. Her eyes, once bright and alert, had grown dull from the combination of fatigue, malnutrition, and constant exposure to harsh elements. The sun beat down on her back as she stooped over the rows of cotton, her fingers working mechanically, following the rhythm ingrained into her over years of repetition. The air around her was thick with dust and the scent of sweat, a pungent reminder of the labor that consumed the plantation from sunrise to sunset. Despite the relentless work, she had learned to pace herself, to conserve energy for moments when the overseer's attention might turn toward her, for any lapse in diligence could mean lashes or humiliation. Her survival depended on a careful balance of obedience and endurance, a precarious dance that required both strength and subtlety. Over the weeks leading up to this morning, the woman's condition had worsened. Fever had given way to weakness, weakness to dizziness, and yet she continued to work, driven by necessity and the invisible pressure that bound her to the rhythm of the plantation. Her fellow slaves noticed the toll it was taking, exchanging worried glances when she stumbled or paused briefly to catch her breath, but none dared speak openly of it. Fear of reprisal from the overseer silenced them, and their compassion had to be hidden behind neutral expression. Every step she took in the field was an act of endurance, a struggle to maintain the facade of strength while her body pleaded for rest. She clutched at the stems of the plants for support, bending slowly, feeling her limbs grow heavier with each passing moment. The slave woman's illness was compounded by neglect. There was no medicine provided, no proper care for the sick or the weary. She had been forced to rely on folk remedies, bits of knowledge passed quietly among the enslaved, crude concoctions that offered temporary relief but did not address the underlying exhaustion and fever that gripped her body. The overseer would have seen such remedies as weakness, a refusal to comply with his expectations, and any complaint of pain could be interpreted as defiance. In this environment, illness became a private burden, a hidden struggle carried beneath the surface while the world demanded ceaseless labor. She bore it alone, her suffering unnoticed or ignored by those who could have alleviated it, and each day she pressed onward despite the growing weight of her frailty. Her clothing hung loosely from her frame, threadbare and worn from years of use. The coarse fabric offered little protection against the biting wind or the scorching sun, and she felt every change in the weather with heightened intensity. A chill in the morning air made her shiver, her teeth chattering as she bent over her work. Yet she did not. The overseer's shadow loomed over the fields constantly, and any sign of weakness could provoke anger. She had learned the language of survival, to move quickly enough to satisfy scrutiny, to speak only when necessary, to hide discomfort behind the mask of dutiful labor. Her body was failing, but her will to endure had hardened over years of oppression, a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished even when her strength faltered. Despite the pain, she kept her mind sharp, remembering the lessons passed down from those who had endured before her. She knew that exhaustion was a dangerous state, one that made mistakes more likely and punishment more severe. Her awareness of her surroundings never wavered. She watched the overseer's movements, anticipated his steps and adjusted her pace accordingly. She understood that her survival depended not only on physical resilience, but also on her ability to navigate the intricate web of control and fear that dominated the plantation. Every action was measured, every breath calculated, as she carried herself forward under the weight of sickness and oppression. Her connection to the other slaves was subtle but profound. They offered silent support, small gestures of empathy passed in a look, a shared sigh or a brief exchange of encouragement. They understood her struggle, for it mirrored their own in countless ways, and their presence gave her a measure of comfort, even in the harshest moment. Yet the fear of the overseer's retribution meant that solidarity had to remain hidden, concealed beneath the routines of labor. Compassion existed in whispers and glances, fleeting moments that reminded her she was not entirely alone, even as her body weakened. As the day wore on, her energy waned further, and every movement became an arduous effort. Her legs trembled under the weight of her body, her fingers ached from the constant bending and pulling, and her back throbbed with a persistent gnawing pain. She had learned to mask the intensity of her suffering, to bend it into a rhythm that would not attract the overseer's attention. Yet she knew that she was reaching the limits of what she could endure. Each step, each task completed was a triumph over her own frailty, a silent assertion of her determination to survive despite the relentless demands placed upon her. The slave woman's condition was no secret to the overseer, yet his concern was non-existent. Where compassion might have guided a humane overseer to grant rest or ease her workload, he saw only the potential for delay, disobedience or weakness. Her vulnerability became an opportunity for him to assert dominance, to reinforce the hierarchy that placed him above all who labored under his watch. In his eyes, her suffering was irrelevant. It existed only as a backdrop to the display of control he sought to maintain. The very act of continuing to work while ill became a testament to the harsh realities of the plantation system, a system where human life was measured by productivity rather than worth. By midday, the slave woman was barely able to stand without support. Sweat mixed with the grime of the field, her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, and her vision blurred intermittently as the fever ravaged her body. Yet she persisted, driven by necessity, fear and the ingrained habit of enduring. She was aware that stopping, even for a moment, could invite punishment, and the thought of the overseer's wrath propelled her forward despite the weakness threatening to overwhelm her. Her determination was remarkable, a testament to the resilience of those who survived under conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. Yet it also highlighted the cruelty of a system that demanded such extremes of human endurance,
without reprieve or mercy. The slave woman's plight was a daily negotiation between life and the expectations of the plantation. Every task completed, every row of crops tended, was a small victory against the debilitating effects of illness and overwork. She pushed through the haze of fever and fatigue with a focus born of necessity, her mind sharp even as her body betrayed her. She had become intimately familiar with the sensations of weakness, the rhythm of pain, and the strategies required to continue laboring under. This intimate knowledge of survival, hard-earned and painful, was her shield against the brutality of the overseer and the relentless demands of the field. The moment the overseer spat on the slave woman was one that would be etched into the memory of everyone present, a vivid act of cruelty so blatant that it seemed almost theatrical in its audacity. He had approached her with the same swagger and imperious air that had defined him for years, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her weakened form. The woman had been barely able to stand, her body trembling from exhaustion and illness, yet she had continued to work in silence, enduring the relentless labor that had sapped her strength. She had kept her head down, avoided direct eye contact, and focused on the task at hand, hoping to pass the overseer's inspection without drawing his ire. But for a man so intent on asserting dominance, mere obedience was not enough. He sought not just control over labor but over the very dignity of those under him, and on this day his cruelty found its most direct expression. He stopped just a few steps away, his shadow falling across her bent form. The other slaves in the field froze, sensing that something beyond routine correction was about to occur. The air grew tense, thick with the fear that had become an almost tangible part of the plantation. The overseer's gaze lingered on her as though weighing her worth, not in terms of productivity or effort, but as a target for humiliation. Then, with a deliberate motion that left no doubt about its intent, he spat on her. The act was quick but loaded with meaning, contempt, dehumanization, and a stark reminder of the power imbalance that governed their lives. The spit landed on her shoulder, cold and insulting, a physical mark of scorn that echoed far beyond the immediate moment. For the woman, the gesture was shocking, not because she had never been subjected to cruelty before but because it was so personal and degrading. It was one thing to endure lashes or shouted orders, it was another to have a substance expelled on her by a man who represented the ultimate authority over her existence. In that instant, all the exhaustion, pain, and suffering she had endured coalesced into a sharp, piercing awareness of her own vulnerability. Her mind raced, balancing the instinct to react against the knowledge that any defiance could provoke further punishment. Her body shivered, not just from fever or fatigue, but from the visceral humiliation of the moment. Yet she remained rooted to the spot, unable to move, paralyzed by the dual weight of fear and indignity. The other slaves bore witness in silence, their fear preventing any intervention. Eyes averted or fixed on the ground, they watched as the overseer exercised his cruelty openly, understanding that to act would invite his wrath upon themselves. In their quiet observation there was both empathy and helplessness. They had known him to be harsh before, but this act of blatant demeaning aggression was different. It transcended the functional discipline of labor and ventured into the territory of personal degradation. Their collective breath seemed to hold in suspense, waiting for what would follow, knowing that the overseer's next move could range from physical punishment to verbal abuse, and fearing for the woman's life even as she bore the insult with stoic endurance. The overseer, emboldened by the silence around him, allowed a moment to linger, letting the humiliation settle like a weight upon the woman. He seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort he had caused, as though the act itself were a reaffirmation of his own superiority. His expression was one of smug satisfaction, a cruel grin that communicated to all who saw it that he was untouchable and that the rules of decency did not apply to him. The power he wielded was absolute in that moment, unchallenged and fully visible to those who understood the precariousness of their own position. The act of spitting was not random. It was deliberate, calculated to reduce the woman not only in the eyes of the overseer but in her own self-perception, to reinforce the notion that she existed solely as an instrument of labor and subjugation. The slave woman, though shaken, did not cry. Her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes lowered to avoid meeting his, and her hands continued their work as best they could. The act of endurance itself became a form of quiet defiance, a refusal to grant him the full satisfaction of a visible emotional response. She felt the cold residue on her skin, a lingering reminder of his contempt, and yet she bore it, drawing on the reservoirs of strength that had sustained her through years of hardship. The physical discomfort was immediate, but it was the emotional and spiritual weight of the insult that pressed most heavily upon her, reminding her of the precariousness of her existence under the overseer's dominion. Around them the plantation continued its rhythm of labor, but for those who witnessed the act, the moment of cruelty hung in the air like a shadow. Conversations ceased, hands froze mid-task, and the usual sounds of the field's rustling leaves, snapping of whipcord, distant calls were momentarily subdued. There was an unspoken understanding that this incident was different, that the overseer had crossed a line that extended beyond routine enforcement into the realm of personal degradation. The other slaves recognized that while they might endure punishment and hardship, witnessing an overt act of contempt directed so personally at one of their own, was a stark reminder of the overseer's capacity for unchecked cruelty. The overseer, satisfied with the visible impact of his act, finally moved on, striding away with the same swagger that had characterized his approach, yet the imprint of his actions lingered, not only on the woman herself but in the collective memory of the field. The act of spitting, small in physical scope, yet monumental in its psychological effect, became a symbol of the systemic cruelty that defined the plantation, a microcosm of the larger oppression at play. For the woman it was a moment that crystallized the harsh reality she faced daily, that her life, her labor and even her dignity were at the mercy of men who wielded power without accountability or restraint. The physical sensation of the spit, cold, wet, and humiliating, remained on her skin as she continued to labor. Each brush of her hands against the fabric of her worn clothing, each movement in the heat of the day carried with it the memory of the act, a tangible reminder of the overseer's presence, and the degradation he imposed. It was a moment that demanded recognition, whether acknowledged openly or internalized quietly, and it became an indelible part of her experience on the plantation. The fields, once just a space of labor, were transformed into a stage for cruelty, a place where human dignity could be assaulted with impunity. Even as the woman worked, her mind processed the incident, turning it over and over, assessing its implications. She thought about the overseer's motivations, about the system that empowered him, and about the consequences that might follow, both for herself and for him. Her endurance in the face of such humiliation was a testament to her resilience, but it also underscored the vulnerability imposed by the hierarchy she lived within. She could not retaliate openly. To do so would risk her life and the safety of others. Instead, she carried the insult within her, transforming it into a quiet, simmering resolve that would remain with her long after the day's labor ended. The other slaves too carried the weight of what they had witnessed. It was a lesson in the extremes of cruelty that authority could permit, a stark illustration of the vulnerability inherent in their lives. While they could not intervene at the moment, the memory of the overseer's action was stored in the consciousness of the group, a shared acknowledgement of both danger and injustice. In their silent observation, they understood the power dynamics at play and the necessity of caution, yet they also felt a flicker of indignation, a spark of empathy that connected them to the suffering of their fellow laborer. The incident, small in duration, but immense in impact, encapsulated the relentless oppression of the plantation system. It was a reminder that the overseer's authority was not limited to managing labor, but extended into the realm of personal humiliation, a tool to enforce obedience and submission. The act of spitting, so brief in execution, reverberated through the lives of all who witnessed it, leaving a lasting imprint of fear, resentment and the harsh reality of life under his control. It became a defining moment for the woman, a pivot in her day that crystallized the cruelty she faced, and the endurance required to survive within the rigid confines of the plantation.
The other slaves on the plantation watched the scene unfold in silence, their hearts pounding in unison, each beat a reminder of their own vulnerability. Fear was a constant companion in their lives, but witnessing the overseer's act of humiliation against one of their own elevated that fear to an almost unbearable level. No one dared step forward. No hand reached out to protect her and no voice called out in protest. They had learned through years of observation and painful experience that intervention often brought worse consequences than enduring the injustice silently. The overseer's wrath was swift, unpredictable, and merciless, and even the slightest display of defiance could result in lashes, beatings, or worse. In their collective silence there was an understanding, a tacit agreement that survival required caution above all else. Even when the soul screamed for action, each of them carried memories of similar incidents, moments when punishment had been meted out arbitrarily and without mercy. They had seen friends and family members reduced to tears, broken physically and emotionally by the overseer's cruelty, and they had learned that the cost of intervention was almost always too high. The plantation operated on a strict hierarchy, with the overseer wielding unchecked authority over every aspect of their labor and movement. Any attempt to oppose him, even for the sake of compassion, risked severe repercussions. And so they stood frozen, rooted to the earth like the crops they tended, bearing witness while concealing their fear and anger behind stoic faces. Their silence was not acceptance but a strategy, a survival tactic honed over years of living under oppression. The fear that gripped them was not only for themselves but for the woman as well. Her weakened state made her especially vulnerable, and they knew that any sign of sympathy or support could draw the overseer's attention to them as well as to her. The tightrope of survival demanded they maintain appearances, that their movements and expressions remain carefully measured. Their eyes followed her every motion, noting the tension in her shoulders, the trembling of her hands, the way she struggled to maintain balance. They sensed the weight of the overseer's dominance, the psychological as well as physical control he exerted, and the magnitude of the insult he had delivered. It was a shared understanding that their collective fear was intertwined, that the woman's suffering was a mirror reflecting their own precarious positions. Yet within this fear there was a current of empathy, a silent acknowledgement of her humanity and dignity. Though no words were spoken, the enslaved watched her closely, registering the subtle signs of her endurance, the quiet bravery in her continued labor despite the humiliation she endured. They recognized the courage it took to persist in the face of such blatant degradation, and this recognition stirred a mix of admiration and sorrow within them. Empathy, however, could not translate into action without risk. It existed in the shadows, in shared glances and knowing nods, in the unspoken bonds that connected them to one another in a world designed to isolate and suppress. The dynamics of the field that day were particularly tense. The overseer had not only humiliated the woman but also reminded everyone else of their collective vulnerability. His actions sent a clear message. No one was immune from his scrutiny, and his authority extended to the very core of their dignity. The subtle glances exchanged among the other slaves were loaded with meaning, expressions of concern, silent communication of support, and mutual reassurance that they understood one another's plight. These small imperceptible gestures were lifelines, tiny threads of connection that offered emotional sustenance in a harsh and isolating environment. The shared experience of witnessing cruelty created a bond among them, even as fear kept them physically restrained from intervening. As the overseer moved away, the silence of the field remained, a heavy, suffocating quiet that was both relief and tension. Relief because the immediate threat had passed, tension because the knowledge that he could return at any moment hung like a dark cloud over their head. The woman continued to work, her movements slow and measured, while the others resumed their labor with a carefulness born of trauma. Their hands were steady, their eyes downcast and their expressions controlled, but beneath the surface the memory of the act remained vivid, a lingering reminder of both the cruelty they had witnessed and the precariousness of their own survival. In that silence there was also a shared reckoning with the nature of power on the plantation. The overseer's cruelty was not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of the system itself, a structure designed to maintain control through fear and subjugation. Every act of humiliation, every lash and every insult reinforced the hierarchy, ensuring compliance through psychological and physical coercion. The enslaved understood this implicitly, recognizing that the overseer's authority was both personal and systemic, and that survival depended on navigating these dangerous currents with caution and vigilance. There was an unspoken recognition among them that moments like this could not be undone. The woman had been spat upon, and no apology, no intervention, and no justice would immediately rectify the insult. What remained was a memory, a record of the event that would persist in their collective consciousness. This memory was both a source of pain and a source of resilience, a reminder of the cruelty they endured and the strength required to survive. The shared witnessing of such acts became a form of silent testimony, a way to preserve the truth of their experiences in a world where voices were often silenced. Each slave processed the event internally, balancing fear, empathy, and self-preservation. Some felt anger simmering beneath the surface, a rage they could not express openly. Others experienced a profound sorrow, mourning the indignity forced upon their fellow laborer, and reflecting on their own vulnerability. These emotions were carefully managed, contained, and often hidden beneath a veneer of obedience and routine. They understood that overexpression of feeling could be dangerous, yet the emotions themselves were real, complex, and deeply human. The act of witnessing cruelty became a shared, internalized experience, shaping their perceptions of the overseer, the plantation, and the fragile boundaries of survival. The psychological impact of the moment extended beyond the field and into the private spaces of the enslaved community. In quiet corners, in whispered conversations at night, and in the small, careful exchanges of shared labor, the memory of the incident was processed and discussed. The event became part of the oral history of the plantation, a story retold in hushed tones to convey both the danger and the courage involved. Through these narratives, the slaves maintained a sense of agency, even in a world where they had little outward power. The act of storytelling allowed them to assert a form of control over the interpretation of events, preserving dignity and humanity in the face of systemic oppression. The shared silence and observation in the field also highlighted the complex social dynamics among the enslaved. Some may have envied her endurance, others may have feared that they could face similar humiliation, and all were reminded of the overseer's omnipresent authority. These layers of awareness created a tense, multi-dimensional experience, in which every glance, every posture and every gesture carried meaning. The field was more than a site of labor. It was a stage where power, fear and survival intersected in ways that required constant vigilance. Through it all, the woman remained at the center of the event, her dignity under assault, her body weakened by illness, and yet her spirit unbroken in its quiet determination to endure. The other slaves, while unable to intervene, drew strength from her resilience, recognizing in her endurance a reflection of their own capacity to survive under impossible circumstances. Her suffering became a shared, emotional experience, a bond forged in the crucible of fear and oppression, and the collective memory of the event would linger, shaping their understanding of cruelty, survival, and the fragile nature of authority on the plantation. The plantation master's absence, or more accurately, his indifference, was a defining factor in the environment of cruelty that had unfolded that morning. While the overseer roamed the fields with unchecked authority, asserting his dominance over the enslaved laborers, the master remained distant, either occupied with business matters in the main house, or deliberately choosing to look away. His presence, had it been engaged, might have tempered the overseer's excesses, introduced some measure of restraint, or at least demanded minimal adherence to rules of decency. But instead there was silence from above, a tacit endorsement that cruelty was permissible as long as productivity continued. In many ways this indifference was as damaging as the overseer's act of brutality, for it reinforced a culture in which suffering and humiliation were normalized and expected, the human cost irrelevant in the calculus of wealth and power. The master's authority existed largely as a symbolic figurehead over the plantation, a presence that could have served as a check on excess, but instead functioned as a silent guarantor of the overseer's action. His lack of engagement signaled to the overseer that he could act without oversight, that every punishment, insult and act of degradation could be meted out without fear of consequence. This dynamic created a dangerous environment, one in which the enslaved were left entirely at the mercy of the overseer's whim. Their survival depended not only on endurance and vigilance, but also on navigating the unpredictable temper of a man whose authority was magnified by the master's detachment. In essence, the master's inattention became a form of complicity, a passive enabling of cruelty that ensured the hierarchy remained rigid and oppressive. The plantation itself was a sprawling, meticulously organized system, designed to maximize output while minimizing the need for direct oversight from the master. Rows of crops stretched across the land, laborers were assigned to carefully monitored tasks, and the overseer acted as the immediate enforcer of productivity and order. The master trusted the overseer to maintain efficiency, to discipline the workers, and to handle the day-to-day operations of the fields. Yet in delegating authority so completely, the master abdicated any responsibility for the moral dimension of their lives. He measured success in terms of harvests, profits, and reports of productivity, not in the welfare of the people who made that wealth possible. His indifference transformed the plantation into a microcosm, where cruelty could flourish unchecked, sanctioned by the silent approval of the very person whose name carried ultimate authority. The absence of intervention on the part of the master also meant that acts of degradation could be performed with impunity. The overseer's decision to spit on the dying slave woman, for example, would have been unthinkable if the master had been present and observant, if moral or social constraints had been enforced from above. But because the master did not watch, did not care, and did not question, the overseer was emboldened to act with full awareness of the power imbalance in his favor. The act was a display not only of personal cruelty but of systemic failure, a convergence of individual malice and structural indifference. The master's absence, both physical and moral, created a vacuum in which such acts could occur, highlighting the way in which hierarchical structures on plantations function to perpetuate suffering rather than mitigate it. For the enslaved, the master's indifference was a constant reminder of their precarious position. They understood that there was no recourse, no authority to appeal to beyond the overseer, and that even minor complaints or requests could be dismissed without consideration. Their entire world was governed by the whims of men who saw them as tools rather than human beings, and the lack of oversight from the master meant that this dehumanization could manifest in the harshest and most arbitrary way. It created a pervasive sense of helplessness, a psychological weight that was nearly as oppressive as the physical labor demanded of them each day. Every humiliation, every punishment, and every act of cruelty reinforced the understanding that their lives and dignity were subject to the whims of those in power, and that no higher authority existed to protect them. The master's detachment also had subtle, indirect effects on the social dynamics of the plantation. It reinforced the overseer's perception of autonomy, encouraging him to extend cruelty beyond what might have been tolerated under closer supervision. It affected the behavior of other workers, who observed the consequences or lack thereof of the overseer's actions, and adjusted their own expectations and interactions accordingly.
The system of fear and obedience became self-reinforcing. The overseer acted with brutality because he could, the enslaved complied out of necessity, and the master's absence guaranteed that the cycle would continue unchallenged. It was a delicate ecosystem of oppression, in which each actor's behavior was shaped by the inaction of the ultimate authority. Moreover, the master's lack of engagement contributed to a sense of invisibility among the enslaved, as though their suffering were beneath notice, unworthy of acknowledgement or compassion. The dying slave woman's plight, her exhaustion, and the humiliation she endured were invisible to him, and by extension irrelevant in the calculus of plantation management. This invisibility was a psychological burden, as well as a physical one, compounding the effects of labor, illness, and abuse. The enslaved lived in a world where their existence was measured only in terms of productivity and utility, and the master's detachment made it abundantly clear that their humanity was secondary, if it mattered at all. It was not that the master was necessarily cruel in an active sense, rather his cruelty lay in neglect, in choosing to prioritize wealth, efficiency and appearances over human decency. His inaction was a tacit sanctioning of the overseer's excesses, a reinforcement of the hierarchy that allowed the most vulnerable to be humiliated and harmed, without consequence. In this way, difference became an instrument of oppression, a quiet but powerful force that enabled cruelty to flourish while leaving the appearance of governance intact. The master's focus on profit and order over moral accountability was a hallmark of the system, a reflection of a society that valued property and output above human life. For the overseer, the master's absence was liberating. It allowed him to act without restraint, to indulge his worst tendencies, and to assert dominance in ways that were both visible and unchallenged. The act of spitting on the slave woman was not merely a personal insult, it was a performance of power made possible because the master provided the conditions for such behavior. The overseer could enforce his authority through fear and humiliation precisely because there was no higher moral authority to constrain him, and this lack of oversight reinforced his belief in his invincibility. Each act of cruelty, each verbal assault, and each punishment became a demonstration of the system itself, a system in which power was unchecked and human dignity was expendable. The absence of the master also shaped the perceptions of the enslaved. They understood that the ultimate authority existed only in theory, and that their lived reality was dictated by the men who chose to exercise their delegated power. Their endurance was therefore not only a response to immediate threats, but also a navigation of a larger structural reality, a world in which the overseer's whims were law, and the master's detachment made justice unlikely. The psychological load of this awareness was immense, as it forced them to internalize rules of survival that prioritized caution, compliance, and observation over confrontation or resistance. The dying slave woman in particular experienced this absence acutely. Her suffering, her weakened state, and the humiliation inflicted by the overseer were rendered more poignant by the knowledge that no one above him would intervene. She was not merely isolated by her illness and exhaustion but also by the social structure itself, which offered her no advocate and no safeguard. The master's indifference was a silent witness to her degradation, an affirmation that her pain was inconsequential and that the overseer's cruelty was not only permitted but implicitly supported. As the overseer turned away from the slave woman, the weight of the insult he had inflicted did not dissipate. Instead, it settled deep within her, a burning presence that ignited a mix of despair, anger and determination. Though her body was failing under the strain of illness and exhaustion, her mind remained sharp, and with clarity that came from years of oppression and survival she recognized the moment for what it was, a final brazen assertion of cruelty designed to strip her of dignity. In that instant, as the overseer strode away with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, a quiet, potent resolve took shape within her. She may have been weak, her limbs trembling and her breathing ragged, yet there was a part of her spirit that refused to submit fully to humiliation. Her eyes, heavy and fevered though they were, fixed on the ground before her as if gathering the strength to endure, to witness and to silently register the injustice that had been done. It was not uncommon for slaves in such dire circumstances to turn inward, to marshal whatever spiritual, mental or emotional resources remained to cope with indignities too severe for physical resistance. The woman's internal response to the act of spitting was multifaceted. There was immediate shock, an instinctive recoil at the personal violation, and a physical sensation of cold and wetness that clung to her skin, reminding her with every movement of the overseer's contempt. But alongside this there was a deeper recognition, an almost instinctive acknowledgement, that even in the face of overpowering force, the human spirit could assert a form of quiet resistance. She could not strike back, she could not verbally retaliate, yet the act of enduring, of refusing to break entirely, became a subtle but significant counteraction to the cruelty imposed upon her. In those moments, A sense of quiet retribution, whether spiritual, moral, or imagined, began to take shape in her consciousness. Perhaps it was a prayer whispered under her breath, or a silent promise that the overseer's arrogance would not go unchecked, that he would someday in some way encounter the consequences of his cruelty. The notion of a curse, a final act of verbal or spiritual condemnation, was not foreign to her. The traditions, stories, and beliefs passed down among slaves often included warnings and moral reckonings that transcended immediate human authority. In that cultural framework, acts of cruelty were not only punishable in the social or legal sense, but also spiritually accountable, and she drew on that belief as a source of psychological fortitude. Her whispered resolve became a shield, something that strengthened her against despair, giving her suffering meaning and her endurance purpose. The slaves who witnessed the act, those who had frozen in fear while the overseer spat, also felt the tension of the moment linger in the air. Though they did not speak of it, they sensed that something had passed between the woman and the overseer that was unseen but profoundly significant. Their understanding of subtle forms of resistance, of endurance as a moral and spiritual act, informed the way they looked at her. To them she became both a symbol and a reminder, a symbol of the unbroken human will, and a reminder that cruelty, no matter how absolute it seemed, was not the final word. Though silence constrained their actions, it could not fully suppress the recognition that some forms of justice, however intangible or delayed, might yet exist beyond the immediate reach of the overseer. Her internal response was shaped by years of navigating the treacherous landscape of plantation life. She had learned that survival required more than physical resilience. It demanded mental acuity, emotional regulation, and a keen sense of time. Every glance from the overseer, every subtle gesture, every moment of potential exposure had to be interpreted and managed. In the act of enduring the spit, she exercised that acquired wisdom. She did not lash out, cry, or beg for mercy. Instead, she maintained control over what little she could control: her reaction, her posture, her breathing, and her silent assertion of inner dignity. In this way she transformed the moment from one of complete humiliation into a quiet exercise of agency, reclaiming a measure of power in a situation where conventional forms of resistance were impossible. As the day wore on, the fever and exhaustion continued to gnaw at her body, yet the psychological and spiritual energy she had summoned in response to the act of humiliation provided a tenuous but vital source of strength. She moved through the field with painstaking care, mindful of every shift in her balance and every sensation of weakness, yet her mind replayed the encounter with the overseer in a way that reinforced her awareness of human morality and the potential for karmic or divine justice. The insult he had delivered was not forgotten, but it had been internalized as a kind of moral ledger, a record of cruelty against which her own silent resolve could stand in contrast. She understood that endurance itself was a form of testimony, a way to assert the existence of justice, even when it was invisible in the immediate, material world. The psychological dimensions of her response were intricate. There was anger, yes, but it was tempered by the necessity of survival. There was humiliation, yet it was transformed into a source of focus, rather than despair. There was fear, sharp and present, yet it was accompanied by the understanding that the overseer's authority, though outwardly absolute, did not extend to the inner realm of her mind and spirit. In this delicate balance of emotions, the seeds of a silent, enduring moral reckoning were sown. Though she could not act physically, and though her body was failing under the combined weight of illness and labor, she had discovered a mode of resistance that no lash, insult, or act of domination could fully erase. Her whispered words, her silent vows, and her inward focus created an invisible yet palpable tension in the field. The other slaves, though unable to intervene, sensed this energy. They could feel that something had shifted, that the dynamics of cruelty and endurance were no longer entirely defined by the overseer's actions alone. The woman had introduced an element beyond his immediate control, an assertion of spiritual and psychological power that could not be measured by productivity, obedience, or physical punishment. In the subtleties of human perception, the other slaves recognized the weight of her internal response and understood its significance. Even in her weakened state, she began to anticipate the potential consequences of the overseer's arrogance. She knew the system rewarded cruelty and that the balance of power could quickly turn against her if she misstepped, yet she also sensed the fragility of such arrogance. Power, when exercised without wisdom, often leaves traces of vulnerability. In the back of her mind she considered the eventual possibility that the overseer's acts might invite repercussions beyond her immediate understanding, whether through chance, accident, or a form of poetic justice, recognized only in the moral or spiritual sense. She allowed herself to believe that cruelty, though momentarily triumphant, could not remain unchecked indefinitely. The act of silent cursing or moral resolve was not unusual among enslaved people, though its power was often underestimated by observers outside the community. It was a deeply rooted practice, intertwined with a belief system in which words, intent and spiritual energy, carried meaning beyond immediate physical circumstances. By focusing her energy, directing her thoughts, and refusing to internalize defeat entirely, the slave woman transformed the overseer's act into something it had not intended, a catalyst for reflection, spiritual assertion, and the assertion of an inner dignity that no external power could truly diminish. Her suffering became a vector for moral reckoning, even if that reckoning was invisible at the moment, residing in a temporal space that the overseer could not perceive or control. The psychological complexity of her endurance extended beyond mere survival. It was an active engagement with the reality of oppression, a conscious decision to assert agency in a context designed to eliminate it. She understood that her endurance was more than a personal act. It was a message, an assertion that even in the harshest conditions, cruelty could not fully dominate the human spirit. The overseer might have believed himself omnipotent, but the woman's inner response revealed the limits of his authority, the domains over which he had no influence, and the subtle ways in which dignity could persist in the face of degradation.
After the overseer spat on the dying slave woman, an air of unease began to settle over the plantation, subtle at first but growing heavier with each passing hour. There was something in the way he carried himself afterward, a swagger that seemed slightly forced, a confidence that masked an underlying tension he could not entirely suppress. The other slaves, though still fearful, began to notice that the event had shifted something in the atmosphere, a sense that the natural order the overseer thought he controlled might not be as absolute as he believed. Rumors whispered among the laborers, brief glances exchanged, and cautious nods acknowledged that cruelty, while unchecked by immediate authority, sometimes leaves traces that extend beyond the visible moment. The overseer's arrogance, so palpable in the act of spitting, had perhaps awakened forces he could neither predict nor control, and the seeds of a reckoning, subtle but inevitable, had been sown in that instant. Strange occurrences began almost imperceptibly, tools misplaced or broken, animals acting skittishly, a sudden chill in the air when the overseer passed through the fields. These were minor at first, easily dismissible as coincidence, yet they created an undercurrent of anxiety. The slaves, attuned to the rhythms of their environment and the patterns of life on the plantation, noticed the changes with a combination of fear and quiet curiosity. They whispered among themselves, interpreting signs and omens in a way that reflected their lived experience, a tradition of understanding the world in terms that included spiritual justice and moral consequence. To them, these events were not merely chance. They were connected to the overseer's cruelty, a subtle response from forces beyond immediate perception. The overseer, for his part, seemed increasingly unsettled, though he would never admit it openly. His usual strut became slightly more calculated, his steps measured as if he anticipated some unseen consequence. He barked orders with the same harshness as before, yet there was an edge to his voice, a tension that suggested unease beneath his practiced authority. When he glanced toward the fields, he sometimes caught sight of fleeting shadows, the subtle movement of animals or the flicker of light in ways that made him hesitate momentarily. These small, unaccountable occurrences were enough to disturb him, though he quickly suppressed any acknowledgement of fear. Pride and arrogance would not allow him to admit vulnerability, and so he pressed forward, trying to reassert dominance even as the environment around him seemed subtly resistant. The other slaves, sensing the overseer's unease, began to respond in quiet ways. Their work continued, as it always did, but there was an added awareness, a heightened sensitivity to the tension in the air. They noticed how the overseer reacted to minor irritations, how he flinched at sudden noises, and how his usual imperious demeanor occasionally faltered for the briefest of moments. Each of these observations was carefully recorded in memory, discussed in hushed tones when the day's labor ended, and interpreted in the context of a moral universe in which acts of cruelty could not go entirely unpunished. Their attention to these subtleties was a form of survival, a means of navigating a dangerous landscape, but it was also a reflection of hope, however quiet, that injustice might carry consequences beyond immediate human enforcement. Ominous events began to escalate subtly. A sudden storm would break over the fields without warning, rain pounding against the slave quarters and scattering the crops. Horses and mules grew skittish, refusing to follow commands that had always been routine. Tools and equipment would fail at critical moments, sending shovels clattering or plows veering off course, as though unseen hands intervened to create disorder. The overseer, convinced at first that these were mere accidents, began to sense a pattern, a sequence of events that seemed almost too pointed to be random. He could not explain why so many misfortunes seemed to coincide with his moments of cruelty, why the environment itself seemed to respond to the injustices he had committed. His mind, long accustomed to control and dominance, struggled to reconcile the unpredictability he now faced with the certainty he had always relied upon. Among the enslaved, interpretations of these events were diverse yet unified by a sense of moral clarity. To some, the occurrences were spiritual warnings, a manifestation of the dying woman's silent curse or the moral weight of her suffering. To others, they were signs of impending retribution, subtle but undeniable hints that the overseer's arrogance had disrupted the natural order. Every crack of thunder, every unexpected stumble of a horse, and every broken tool became a symbol, a signal that injustice carries consequences beyond human force. In their careful observation, the slaves found reassurance, a reminder that even the most powerful and cruel might one day face reckoning, even if it arrived in ways they could not immediately understand or influence. The overseer's behavior began to change noticeably. He became more irritable, quick to anger over trivial matters, and increasingly suspicious of the smallest infractions by the laborers. His steps were measured but tense, his voice sharp but carrying an undertone of unease. Even routine inspections became charged with anxiety, as he struggled to maintain the veneer of control while subconsciously aware that something beyond his understanding was unfolding. Each misstep by the slaves seemed magnified in his perception, reinforcing a growing paranoia that the world was reacting against him. This shift in demeanor did not go unnoticed by those under his authority. They observed the tension, interpreting it as a sign that power, though outwardly dominant, is vulnerable to forces that cannot be fully contained. At night, the plantation itself seemed to participate in the unsettling sequence. Doors creaked, windows rattled, and the wind whispered through the trees in ways that unsettled even the overseer, who was accustomed to harsh conditions and the rigors of plantation life. He began to imagine threats where none existed, shadows taking on menacing forms, and every sound amplified into a potential sign of danger. The other slaves, while fearful of the night's events, recognized patterns they had long understood. The universe, or at least the moral order of their world, does not ignore acts of cruelty. Their interpretation provided a sense of connection to justice, a reassurance that the overseer's tyranny, though terrifying, was not absolute and could be disrupted by forces beyond his comprehension. Even small coincidences took on significance. A bird crashing into a window, a sudden illness among his horses, or a misalignment in the tools he relied upon became points of anxiety. The overseer, previously confident in his ability to command the plantation and all who lived on it, now faced a subtle but pervasive uncertainty. His arrogance, which had flourished so openly in the act of spitting on the dying woman, was challenged by events that seemed to resist his control. Though he could not openly acknowledge it, he was beginning to recognize that his cruelty had consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment, consequences that could manifest in unpredictable, sometimes frightening ways. The enslaved workers, attuned to these shifts, drew strength from their observations. They noted the overseer's unease and shared glances and whispered acknowledgments that conveyed understanding and reassurance. The environment itself seemed to offer them a kind of protection, a sense that the balance of justice, though slow and mysterious, was not entirely absent. The tension created by the overseer's growing apprehension was a subtle relief, a small but significant disruption of the power dynamics that had long oppressed them. While they remained cautious, aware that any overt action could be dangerous, the change in the overseer's demeanor offered hope that his dominance was neither complete nor unassailable. Through it all, the dying slave woman remained central to the unfolding drama, her silent endurance and whispered resolutions a catalyst for the subtle shifts occurring around her. Though her body weakened further with each passing hour, her spiritual and psychological influence seemed to ripple outward. The whispers of morality, the unseen consequences of cruelty, and the acknowledgement of injustice began to permeate the plantation, creating an atmosphere charged with anticipation and unease. The overseer, oblivious to the power of the human spirit he sought to suppress, experienced the first tremors of a reckoning that would ultimately confront him directly, though he could not yet see the shape or timing of it. As the days passed following the overseer's act of cruelty, the tension on the plantation continued to build, growing almost tangible in the thick heat of the field. The dying slave woman remained at the center of this unseen storm, her body weakened by illness, yet her presence commanding in ways that transcended physical strength. She moved slowly, painfully, yet with a quiet determination that could not be ignored. Every step she took seemed infused with an inner energy that the overseer could neither anticipate nor control. Though he sought to assert dominance in every glance, every command, and every threat, there was now an undercurrent of fear that had begun to settle into his consciousness, a sense that the forces he had always believed were firmly under his command were subtly rebelling against him. The slaves observed these shifts with a mixture of apprehension and quiet hope. They noticed the subtle changes in the overseer's demeanor, a momentary hesitation before issuing orders, an uncharacteristic glance over his shoulder as if expecting something to go wrong, a tightening of his jaw when the wind blew unexpectedly, or when animals reacted unpredictably. These were small signs, almost imperceptible,
yet they carried immense meaning for those who lived under his rule. Each tremor of doubt, each flicker of unease, was a reassurance to the enslaved that cruelty was not invincible, that arrogance could encounter resistance, and that even those who appeared powerful could be shaken by forces beyond their understanding. The dying woman herself became increasingly aware of the subtle ripples her endurance seemed to create. She had learned, over a lifetime of hardship, that acts of defiance need not be loud to carry weight. Sometimes quiet resistance, perseverance and moral clarity exerted influence in ways that were invisible to the oppressed. As she moved through the fields, the overseer's presence loomed, but she maintained her focus, her hands working in rhythm with the planting and harvesting despite the weakness in her limb. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, yet her gaze remained steady, as though silently asserting her unwillingness to be completely subdued by his cruelty. The psychological impact of the overseer's growing anxiety began to manifest in tangible ways. Tools would fail at critical moments, equipment would break, and animals that had long been obedient became unpredictable, skittish and difficult to control. The overseer, who had previously considered himself the master of every detail on the plantation, began to perceive patterns that he could not rationalize. A plow breaking when he leaned too heavily on it, a horse rearing unexpectedly, or even a sudden gust of wind disrupting his inspection of the fields all contributed to a creeping sense of vulnerability. Each occurrence, seemingly minor, fed into the tension he could not name, a silent acknowledgement that his authority was not absolute, and that the universe in its subtle and mysterious ways had begun to push back against his cruelty. The enslaved interpreted these events through a lens shaped by experience, culture and oral traditions. To them there was a moral order in the world, a sense that acts of cruelty carried weight beyond immediate perception. The overseer's behavior, once considered unassailable, now appeared fragile in ways that they could understand intuitively. They whispered among themselves, shared knowing glances, and drew quiet lessons from the environment's subtle responses. To them, the dying woman's endurance was not merely survival. It was a form of spiritual and moral assertion, a demonstration that cruelty leaves traces, and that the human spirit can persist, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. The overseer's paranoia grew incrementally, manifesting in sharper tones, quicker movements, and a harsher enforcement of labor rules. He became increasingly impatient with minor infractions, perceiving them as challenges to his authority, even when the infractions were accidental or inconsequential. His every command was delivered with added intensity, his presence in the fields more aggressive, yet beneath it all lay a tension he could not articulate. He sensed that the plantation itself had shifted subtly in response to his cruelty, that his environment no longer entirely obeyed his will. This recognition, whether conscious or subconscious, began to dominate his thoughts, influencing his behavior and amplifying the sense of unease that permeated the fields. The dying slave woman, despite her frailty, became a symbol in this unfolding narrative. Her suffering, her persistence, and her silent assertion of dignity resonated with the other enslaved individuals. They drew strength from her example, recognizing that the endurance of one person could alter the psychological landscape for all. Her presence became a quiet catalyst for hope, a demonstration that resilience and moral clarity could exert influence even in the absence of direct action. In her perseverance they found affirmation that acts of cruelty were not uncontested, that power, no matter how absolute it appeared, could be subtly challenged through courage and determination. At night, the plantation took on an eerie quality. The wind seemed to carry whispers, the trees cast shadows that moved like silent observers, and the animals responded in ways that defied expectation. The overseer, already tense from the day's events, interpreted these occurrences as threats or signs of disorder, further amplifying his anxiety. He could not explain why misfortune seemed to align with the moment of his cruelty, and his inability to control these subtle disturbances eroded the confidence he had always displayed so openly. The psychological burden of perceived vulnerability began to weigh on him, affecting not only his behavior, but also his ability to command respect through fear alone. The enslaved workers, attuned to the shifts in both the overseer and the environment, continued their labor with vigilance and quiet awareness. They noticed that his overreactions, his irritability and his sudden misjudgments were opportunities to maintain their own safety while observing the unfolding consequences of cruelty. They understood, in ways that the overseer could not, that moral and spiritual forces operated beyond the immediate visible realm. The small disturbances in the fields, the misaligned tools, the unpredictable animals, and the subtle environmental changes were interpreted as manifestations of justice or karmic response. These interpretations were empowering, offering reassurance that acts of cruelty had consequences even when human oversight was absent or indifferent. The psychological interplay between the overseer, the dying woman and the environment intensified over the following day. He became hyper-vigilant, scrutinizing every movement and reaction, convinced that minor incidents were omens of larger disruptions. His authority, once perceived as absolute, began to feel precarious. Each unexpected event heightened his stress and paranoia, creating a feedback loop in which his own actions, harsh commands, threats and increased scrutiny provoked further resistance, whether consciously intended or not. The plantation itself seemed to respond to this tension, reinforcing the sense that the universe, or some moral order, was attuned to the injustices committed within it. The dying woman's endurance, combined with the subtle disturbances affecting the overseer, created a dynamic in which the balance of power shifted imperceptibly but significantly. Though she could not confront him physically, and though the other slaves could not openly resist, the psychological and moral consequences of the act of cruelty began to unfold in a pattern that the overseer could neither predict nor fully control. This invisible influence was perhaps more powerful than any direct confrontation, illustrating that moral authority and spiritual resilience could challenge tyranny in ways that were subtle, indirect and deeply effective. By the 9th day following the overseer's act of cruelty, the plantation had become a place heavy with tension, where every movement, every sound, and every glance carried heightened significance. The enslaved laborers continued their work with the same diligence as always, yet there was an underlying awareness, a shared consciousness that something had shifted in the balance of power. The overseer, once supremely confident in his dominance, had begun to exhibit subtle signs of fear and unease that did not go unnoticed by those who worked under him. His steps were more deliberate, his voice sharper yet tinged with irritability, and his glare, once a tool of pure intimidation, now flickered with an almost imperceptible uncertainty. The events that had begun with a single act of humiliation, the spitting on the dying slave woman, had set in motion a chain reaction that altered the psychological and spiritual landscape of the plantation, creating a sense of apprehension that hovered over every field, path and dwelling. The dying slave woman, frail and weakened, continued to move with painstaking care through the labor assigned to her. Each motion was an effort of will, a negotiation between the demands of her body and the imperatives of survival. Yet despite her exhaustion, there was a visible determination in her posture, her refusal to allow the overseer's cruelty to dominate her inner sense of self. Her endurance became a focal point, not only for her own survival but also for the collective awareness of the other slaves. They observed her quietly, noting how she carried herself with dignity, even as her body betrayed her. In the way she endured, they saw a form of moral and spiritual strength that transcended the immediate circumstances, an assertion of human dignity in a system designed to strip it away. The overseer, meanwhile, was increasingly on edge. He could not explain the cascade of misfortunes that seemed to shadow him, from misaligned tools, to skittish animals, and sudden unaccountable disturbances in the field. These occurrences, while minor in isolation, accumulated in a pattern that gnawed at his confidence. Each unexpected incident seemed to echo the moment of his cruelty, as if the plantation itself had begun to resist his authority. He had always believed that fear alone was sufficient to maintain control, that dominance could be asserted through visible acts of power, but now he confronted forces he could neither rationalize nor command. The psychological toll was evident in the tightening of his shoulders, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, and the small habitual adjustments he made when moving through the fields, as if anticipating calamity at every turn. The other enslaved individuals watched these changes with a complex mixture of fear, hope and moral clarity. They were deeply attuned to patterns in the overseer's behavior, interpreting his irritability, misjudgments, and overreactions as signals that the moral weight of cruelty was asserting itself in subtle but undeniable ways. Whispers circulated quietly among them, cautious observations exchanged in tones that avoided detection. They recognized that the overseer's authority, though outwardly formidable, was not immune to the consequences of his own action. Each small disruption, each unforeseen failure, and each unanticipated event reinforced a shared understanding. Cruelty carries consequences, and those consequences often manifest in ways beyond immediate perception or control. The interplay between the overseer's fear and the dying woman's endurance intensified as the days passed. The field became a stage for a silent, almost imperceptible struggle between tyranny and resilience. The overseer sought to assert dominance, issuing commands with increasing severity, attempting to impose order through intimidation, yet his actions were undermined by a growing sense of unpredictability in the environment. Animals reacted unpredictably, tools faltered, and minor accidents occurred with a frequency that seemed disproportionate. To the overseer, these events were nuisances at first, but gradually they became sources of anxiety, reinforcing a perception that his power was being challenged by forces he could neither see nor fully comprehend. For the dying woman, each day was a negotiation between the fragility of her body and the assertion of her inner strength. She recognized the risks inherent in maintaining even a quiet defiance, yet she continued to hold herself with a dignity that spoke volumes. Her endurance was a subtle act of resistance, a statement that the overseer's cruelty could not extinguish the essence of her humanity. The other slaves observing this found inspiration in her example. They internalized her resilience as a model for navigating their own challenges, a reminder that survival and dignity could coexist even in the most oppressive conditions. Her presence became a quiet beacon, an affirmation that moral and spiritual integrity need not be sacrificed to physical subjugation. The overseer's anxiety had begun to manifest in tangible ways. He became prone to overreacting to trivial matters, interpreting minor missteps as deliberate challenges to his authority. His instructions, once delivered with the cold efficiency of experience, now carried a tone of paranoia, his movements calculated to anticipate threats that might not exist. This heightened vigilance, while intended to reinforce control, had the paradoxical effect of further undermining it. His fear, amplified by every unexpected disruption, created an atmosphere of tension that permeated the plantation, affecting not only his behavior but also the perceptions and actions of those around him. The enslaved laborers, keen observers of these dynamics, recognized the significance of these shifts. They understood that the overseer's fear, though subtle, was evidence that the balance of power was more complex than simple physical dominance might suggest. They interpreted the disruptions and misfortunes as extensions of the moral consequences of his cruelty, manifestations of justice, operating in ways that human authority could not anticipate or control. This awareness reinforced a sense of psychological safety and moral validation, offering the enslaved a framework in which endurance, patience, and quiet resistance carried tangible, if indirect, power. Even in the privacy of the night, the overseer's unease persisted. The sounds of the plantation, the creaking of doors, the rustling of trees, the distant movement of animals, took on menacing qualities in his mind. Shadows seemed to shift with intent, and every small disturbance was interpreted as a warning or an omen. His confidence, once absolute, now wavered, and he increasingly questioned his ability to maintain control. This internal tension, though invisible to the casual observer, shaped every interaction, every decision and every command he issued. The act of cruelty he had committed on the dying woman's body, intended to assert unchallengeable dominance, had become the catalyst for his own psychological unraveling. The dying woman, aware of the subtle changes in the overseer's demeanor, drew quiet strength from her own moral and spiritual understanding. She recognized that acts of cruelty, while seemingly triumphant in the moment, often set in motion forces beyond the immediate material world. Her endurance was not merely about survival, it was about asserting a moral presence, a claim to dignity that transcended the physical constraints imposed by the overseer. She moved through her labor with careful attention, conserving energy while maintaining visibility, a symbol of resilience that reinforced the psychological shifts occurring around her. The interplay of these forces, the overseer's growing anxiety, the subtle disruptions in the environment, and the silent moral authority embodied by the dying woman, created a tension that resonated throughout the plantation. Each day amplified the stakes, as the overseer's fear intensified, and the enslaved observed, interpreted, and internalized the unfolding dynamics. The psychological and spiritual consequences of cruelty, previously abstract and distant, became immediate and tangible. In this context, the plantation existed not only as a site of labor and oppression, but also as a theater in which moral resilience, endurance, and the consequences of unchecked tyranny played out with increasing clarity.
By the 10th day, the atmosphere on the plantation had shifted entirely. The overseer, who had once wielded his authority with unshakable confidence, now carried a visible tension that affected every interaction and movement. The incident with the dying slave woman, the act of spitting, the public display of humiliation had become a catalyst for a series of subtle yet undeniable changes. The overseer's arrogance, which had long gone unchallenged, began to show cracks manifested in quickened breathing, taut muscles, and a heightened awareness of every minor disruption in the fields. The enslaved, who had previously worked under the constant shadow of his wrath, now observed these changes with a cautious mixture of hope, curiosity, and quiet satisfaction. The dying slave woman remained at the center of this transformation, her presence a silent yet powerful influence. She moved through the labor with painstaking care, her weakened body a constant reminder of her vulnerability, yet her inner resolve radiated a strength that belied her physical condition. Each step, each motion of her hands planting, hoeing, or tending the crops carried the weight of quiet defiance. She understood that while her actions might seem inconsequential to the overseer, they were anything but. Her endurance, her refusal to fully yield to despair, had begun to affect the energy of the plantation itself. Those around her, whether conscious of it or not, felt the ripple effects of her resilience. The overseer, increasingly aware of the unusual occurrences around him, grew progressively paranoid. Horses became skittish, tools malfunctioned at the most inconvenient moments, and sudden gusts of wind or bursts of weather seemed almost to conspire against him. He could not explain these disruptions logically, and his mind, conditioned to total control, struggled to reconcile the unpredictability of the environment with his perception of authority. Each failure, each unexpected event, was magnified in his awareness, feeding the growing sense of instability that he could neither anticipate nor fully manage. His efforts to restore control only intensified his anxiety, creating a feedback loop in which fear reinforced itself and undermined his ability to act decisively. The enslaved workers noticed these subtle shifts with a mix of awe and caution. They observed the overseer's tension, the faltering of his once commanding presence, and the seemingly inexplicable disruptions in the environment, and they interpreted these signs through the lens of lived experience and cultural knowledge. They understood that acts of cruelty carried consequences that were not always immediate or visible. The dying woman's quiet endurance, her unwavering dignity, had begun to operate as a form of moral and spiritual influence. In their understanding, justice was not only a matter of human action, it was also a natural and moral force capable of responding to the imbalance created by unchecked cruelty. Each day that passed reinforced the subtle shift in power dynamic. The overseer became increasingly erratic, overcompensating with harsher commands, stricter supervision, and relentless enforcement of tasks. Yet even as he tried to assert his dominance, his anxiety undermined him. Minor mishaps, tools breaking, animals misbehaving, sudden weather disturbances felt imbued with intention in his mind. He began to perceive threats where none objectively existed, his every movement cautious, his confidence eroded. The enslaved, while outwardly maintaining the necessary obedience, recognized the change and drew quiet reassurance from it. The moral and psychological imbalance that had once favored the overseer was now shifting, subtly but unmistakably, toward a reckoning that seemed inevitable. The dying slave woman, aware of the growing unease around her, remained composed and focused. Her endurance was not only physical, it was psychological and spiritual. She understood that acts of cruelty, though they could dominate in the immediate moment, often carried unseen consequences that unfolded over time. Her suffering had become a form of moral ledger, an unspoken tally of injustice that weighed upon the conscience of the perpetrator. In this way, her presence served as a constant reminder to the overseer, and to all who witnessed her, that cruelty is not without consequence, that arrogance can be destabilized, and that endurance can exert influence in ways far beyond the physical. The psychological environment of the plantation became charged with tension. The overseer, once a figure of unchallenged authority, was now navigating a landscape that seemed to resist his control at every turn. Minor accidents, animal misbehavior, and environmental disruptions created a pervasive sense of unease that permeated every field and structure. The enslaved observed these events with a complex mixture of fear, vigilance, and moral clarity. They recognized the pattern, understood its implications, and internalized the lessons embedded within. Survival required caution, yet their observation revealed that power, no matter how seemingly absolute, is inherently vulnerable to moral and spiritual forces that transcend immediate authority. At night, the plantation took on an almost ominous quality. The wind carried sounds that seemed to amplify the overseer's fears, trees swayed with uncanny movement, and shadows cast by the moonlight appeared to shift and twist unnaturally. The overseer, already anxious from the day's disruptions, interpreted these phenomena as signs of impending consequences, as manifestations of the moral weight of his cruelty. His fear became a self-fulfilling cycle, as his tension provoked more mistakes, and each mistake seemed to validate his growing sense of vulnerability. He could not understand how the events connected to the simple act of spitting on the dying woman, yet deep within him, he sensed an unseen force had been awakened, one that would not be contained by mere physical authority or intimidation. The enslaved drew meaning from the interplay of these forces. To them, the shifts in the overseer's behavior, the unusual occurrences in the environment, and the dying woman's quiet endurance, were all signs that justice, though delayed and often invisible, was operating within the moral fabric of their world. They internalized this understanding as a source of strength, a confirmation that endurance, courage, and moral clarity could assert influence even in circumstances of extreme oppression. The subtle transformations of the overseer's demeanor reinforced the belief that cruelty, when unchecked by conscience or accountability, ultimately carries consequences. As the overseer's paranoia intensified, his health and composure began to deteriorate. His appetite diminished, his sleep became restless, and he exhibited signs of high tension, such as clenched fists, furrowed brows, and sudden outbursts over minor issues. The dying woman's endurance, combined with the perceived resistance of the environment, had created a psychological pressure that he could not escape. The plantation itself seemed to conspire against him, not through conscious intent, but as a reflection of the cumulative consequences of his cruelty, magnified by the moral and spiritual weight that the enslaved recognized intuitively. In response to this mounting tension, the overseer's actions became increasingly erratic. Commands were delivered with unnecessary force, inspections were rushed or inconsistent,
and his presence in the fields carried a palpable anxiety that affected every interaction. Even the enslaved, while outwardly compliant, could sense his instability, recognizing in his behavior the early signs of unraveling. Their understanding of the moral and psychological consequences at play allowed them to navigate the environment with cautious optimism. The enduring presence of the dying woman, combined with the subtle but persistent misfortunes affecting the overseer, created a landscape in which cruelty no longer appeared invincible. The dying slave woman's role in this unfolding drama was central, though her physical weakness contrasted sharply with the psychological power she exerted through endurance and moral clarity. She had endured humiliation, illness, and pain, yet her spirit remained unbroken. The overseer, once confident in his dominion, now faced an invisible reckoning that he could not control or predict. Each moment of her continued survival was a quiet reminder that human dignity cannot be entirely destroyed, that moral and spiritual influence operates independently of immediate authority, and that acts of cruelty ultimately invite consequences beyond the moment in which they occur. The following morning, the overseer awoke with a sense of foreboding he could no longer dismiss. His body ached with tension, his mind raced with visions of misfortune, and even the air felt heavy around him, charged with the lingering presence of forces he could not see or control. That day, small accidents compounded into larger disasters. A horse reared and threw him to the ground, a cart he had insisted on driving tipped over, scattering tools and injuring his hand, and the fields themselves seemed to conspire against him. Each misfortune was a mirror of the cruelty he had inflicted on the dying woman, each a reminder that actions carried weight far beyond the moment. Panic replaced arrogance, and fear now governed his every step, rendering the authority he had relied upon meaningless. The enslaved gathered cautiously, their work continuing under the ever-watchful eye of those who feared the consequences of speaking openly, yet they could not ignore the transformation in the overseer. Whispers circulated about the events that morning, and even the most skeptical among them could sense that some form of moral justice had been enacted. The dying woman, though still weak and faltering in her movements, seemed untouched by despair. There was a quiet glow about her, a recognition that the scales had begun to tip, that the universe, or fate, had acknowledged the injustice she had endured. Her endurance, dignity, and silent defiance had not only survived, but had catalyzed a reckoning far greater than any physical retaliation could achieve. By midday, the overseer's health deteriorated sharply. The tension that had haunted him for days manifested in fevered trembling, dizziness, and eventual collapse. The plantation's atmosphere was thick with the weight of what had occurred, a living testament to the consequences of unbridled cruelty, witnessed by those whose suffering had been ignored for far too long. No human intervention, no punishment from the master, had been necessary. The moral and spiritual balance had corrected itself in ways that were undeniable to anyone who observed close. The overseer, who had once ruled through fear and brutality, was rendered powerless by forces he had failed to respect, and his fall served as a stark lesson to all who might have followed his example. The dying woman, though still fragile, was transformed in the eyes of the plantation. She became a symbol of resilience, a living embodiment of the principle that human dignity cannot be destroyed by violence alone. Her silent courage had reshaped the plantation's moral landscape, illustrating that endurance, integrity, and moral clarity carry consequences that outlast physical suffering. The other slaves, witnessing the overseer's downfall, found a renewed sense of hope. They understood that while the systems of oppression remained harsh and unjust, moments of justice, quiet, precise, and inevitable, could emerge, guided by principles deeper than fear or physical dominance. In the final moments, the overseer's arrogance had crumbled entirely, leaving him a shadow of the man he once believed himself to be. His collapse was not only physical but moral and spiritual, a demonstration that cruelty, unchecked, invites consequences that extend far beyond human control. The dying woman's victory was subtle but absolute, proving that endurance, dignity, and moral fortitude carry a power unmatched by violence. In that moment, the plantation itself seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifted slightly, and the legacy of one woman's courage became a permanent reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, justice, quiet, relentless, and unerring, will find a way to assert itself.